We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, who we're really thrilled is here today. Jeffrey Goldberg, author and national correspondent at The Atlantic. He's just back from accompanying President Barack Obama on his trip to Malaysia. Today, he's going to be speaking about the future of the US in the Middle East. He is, for many, simply the preeminent voice amongst American Jews. That's a lot of opinions to represent, Jeffrey, so I'll let you get on with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm not 100% sure. It's a big crowd. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Haaretz, Amos, and Aluf, and the JCC. As was mentioned, I just got off a plane from Malaysia, and Ronit, Jacobs being a very smart person, arranged for a double espresso for me to ward off the jet lag. And also, she arranged for me to have a half-hour argument with Tzipi Hodavelli just a few minutes ago. You know, Jews aren't fully awake unless we're arguing, you know? So I think that was the, I want to thank Tzipi for arguing with me for a half hour. It really woke me up. So the topic that I'm supposed to address is almost absurd in its complexity. So I'm just going to take 3 or 4 hours and try to work our way through Sykes-Picot up to the present day. I'm reminded, this topic reminds me of a phone call I got not long ago from a leader of another Jewish organization, a women's organization that I don't want to name, but it rhymes with Shmadasa. And this person asked me to come speak to her chapter of the group, and I said, what do you want me to talk about? This is a true story, by the way. I said, what do you want me to talk about? And she said, well, our members are very interested in understanding international terrorism, and they're interested in understanding the future of politics in Israel and the Arab-Israeli minority, and if there's ever going to be a Palestinian state, and also if you could talk about Syria and Iraq and what's happening there, and also if you could explain the roots of Islamic fundamentalism. And I said, sure. How much time do I have? And she said, 15 minutes. And then she said, I'm also not making this part up as well. She said, and listen, these are very depressing subjects, so could you try to keep it light? I have nothing particularly light to share with you today, I'm sorry to tell you in these few minutes that I have. As was mentioned, I just came off the president's trip to Asia, and so I want to start this talk by pivoting to Asia, if you will, because I think we can explain what's happening in U.S.-Middle East relations by looking at other parts of the world. As a lot of you know who follow the news, the president has been interested for years in the so-called pivot to Asia. They started using the word pivot several years ago, and then were told that they can't use that term anymore, the administration can't, because superpowers don't pivot, where superpowers have to be everywhere at once. So pivoting implies that you're turning your back on someone. So they changed the terminology to a euphemism, rebalance. We're rebalancing toward Asia. It means the same thing, and I've been fascinated with this for a while because you get the very, and I've been covering President Obama since he was in the Senate, you get the real sense of how desperate he is to move America's focus to Asia and away from the Middle East. I saw this very viscerally. We were in Manila a few days ago, and at the ASEAN convention conference, and President Obama arranged so that Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, which is the sort of the Chinese Amazon, and a young Filipina who had invented, some young Filipina entrepreneur invented a lamp that runs on salt water, and he likes these people so much that he decided he would interview them on stage, which was very interesting to watch because in hierarchical Asian political cultures, the head of state doesn't do the interview, and the audience was sort of wowed by this, and I was wowed by this because I have very seldom, and I speak to someone who watches him closely, very seldom seen him so happy to be having this conversation, which he thought was a conversation about the future, about entrepreneurial behavior, about opportunities for America, and then of course he comes off the stage. And there's a press availability a little bit later, and all of the questions are about Syria and Paris. And you could see, you can almost physically see, sort of the curtain fall, in front of his face. And so it's he obviously understands that the Middle East is a place that America has to focus on right now. But, and this is not his opinion, this is my opinion, for however much time we spend invested in the Middle East is America's past. Asia is America's future. And that's what I want to talk about and frame that out just for a few minutes. There's no doubt in my mind that the Middle East and its problems, America, and not just the president, would like to put in the rearview mirror. Now, obviously, since the end of World War II, we've had any number of serious interests in the Middle East. Oil and the smooth flow of energy resources has been obviously the overwhelmingly important interest that the United States has had. We've had an interest, particularly since 1979, in the suppression and containment of extremism, and that obviously is the number one problem we're facing at the moment. Then we've had many interests, but these are the three big ones to me. The third interest is supporting and defending and propping up the state of Israel. If the first one, the protection of our oil and the protection of the movement of oil, is one that's rooted in realpolitik, the third one, the defense and protection of Israel, is rooted and has been rooted in American idealism. But we are moving away from a number of issues that have kept us so enraptured by the Middle East. We are obviously, as a country, moving toward energy independence. And there will come a time when we get no oil whatsoever, we're getting there very quickly, from Middle East states. And there will be a time, right now when you say this, certainly in foreign policy circles, when you say this, people don't believe you. But there will become a time when we won't mind that the Chinese Navy is providing security in the Persian Gulf. Most of the oil moving out of through the Strait of Hormuz goes east. Right now, as a superpower and as a worried about the rise of China, we wouldn't be very happy seeing the Chinese Navy. Not that they have the Navy capable of doing this yet, but we wouldn't be happy seeing them in the Persian Gulf in any strength. But I think 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we're going to realize that there's no reason for us to be paying for security for other countries to make sure that they get their oil. So that story is one that's coming to an end. It will come to an end when the Saudi when the House of Saud falls, and it will, it's easy to make predictions. It's easy to make predictions about things that happen 50 years from now because I'll be dead, but I'm going to go farther and say that in another 5 to 10 years, we're going to see real problems in the way Saudi Arabia is functioning. But again, it won't matter quite as much. Now, the second issue, of course, the suppression of terrorism, the containment of extremism, because I don't think anybody, when people talk on the record about it, they talk about destroying ISIS, but what we're really talking about is containing and marginalizing a problem. This is not just a problem with an organization, it's a problem with an ideology. And again, I was out of the country during this, but we were getting enough to know, and the president was certainly upset enough to communicate this to us. This conversation about Syrian refugees was absurd on so many levels, not least of which the problem in America is not, and the problem in Europe is not and has not been terrorism coming from Syrian refugees. It's coming from the self-radicalized or internet radicalized, fully assimilated or seemingly fully assimilated Yemeni American or Sudanese American or Egyptian American. It has really very little to do with this issue. So we're not going to be able to suppress that and contain it, but this president in particular believes, not an endorsement of his belief, just an observation about his belief, that you can put this in enough of a box that it becomes a manageable problem. So we move to the third issue, and I want to do this very quickly because I want to go to questions as quickly as we can. The third issue is is Israel and America's relationship with Israel. This is a very, very dangerous moment in America for Israel for a number of reasons. Now, for most of our lives, Israel has been a relatively uncontroversial and bipartisan cause in the United States. The bipartisan part is under strain, a strain induced mainly by Netanyahu, the prime minister's decision to turn Iran into somewhat of a partisan issue. But underneath that decision were some tectonic plate shifts, which we can talk about in a minute. But the broader danger is that when the United States decides that it's had enough of the Middle East. And here I think that President Obama is not an outlier. I think he's a leading indicator. When the United States decides it has enough of the Middle East, the relationship between Israel and the United States will only survive and be healthy if Americans look at Israel and decide that and see that it resembles their own country. If Americans look at Israel and see it as another dysfunctional Middle Eastern state, then that relationship will come to a gradual end. I'm often asked if this is an aberrational moment or something we can learn about the future. Aberrational in the following sense: people often ask, is Obama's lack of interest in the Middle East or his desire to withdraw the U.S. from the Middle East, is that something that will end on January 20th, 2017? Will the next president restore harmony to the traditional relationships between the U.S. and its allies? I would say that what we're seeing is superficially aberrational in the following sense. When President Hillary Clinton takes office, or President Rubio, or President Trump, I can't, what did my grandmother say? I can't even. I can't even. Whoever becomes the next president, and this is obviously ruling out Rand Paul because he's an outlier in this subject, whoever becomes the next president will want to restore balance to our relationships or to reset relations between our traditional Arab allies in the U.S. and, of course, between Israel and the U.S. And that means a president who is more publicly forgiving of Israeli decisions the president he or she doesn't like. But I really do believe that underneath what is going to be a reset, there are plate shifts that we have to be aware of. And I don't think the people who need to be most aware of it, meaning the people who are currently ruling Israel, are quite aware of what is going on. What happens on the campuses doesn't stay on the campuses. What's happening in the Democratic Party doesn't stay in the Democratic Party. I'll tell you a very short story, because this is the moment when I realized that something was awry. I was in a sukkah a couple of years ago in Washington. It was like a power sukkah. We actually have that in Washington, believe it or not. And there was it's a very Jewish place now. And there was I guess Sukkot are off the record, I guess, so I can't tell you the identities of these people, but there was a very important Israeli politician in this particular sukkah and a very important American Jewish figure in this sukkah. And this was at a time, if you recall, where there was, I mean, this is still going on, there was a time when there was a lot of discussion in Israel about passing laws that would limit the activities of certain NGOs who were felt by the Israeli government to be hostile to Israel. I mean, the feeling was correct; these NGOs are hostile to Israel, but the discussion was around what to do about it, how to stop their funding, and in some cases, how to stop what they're saying, how to stop them from saying what they're saying. And the Israeli leader in this sukkah was making a very cogent argument that these radical Norwegian NGOs are not the friends of the Jewish people, and providing evidence to support that claim. And it was going on in a very rational way about why they need to be controlled. The American Jewish figure said, and this will always stay with me, said, but the reason we love Israel is because you allow people like that to exist and flourish. If you start to suppress speech you don't like, speech that may be heinous, but if you start suppressing that, we won't even recognize you anymore. not recognize you diplomatically. We won't understand who you are. You will be different than the thing that we know and we love. And this is a mainstream middle-aged Jewish American figure. This is not a 23-year-old or a 19-year-old Jewish kid who's deciding, at Berkeley to join either J Street or JVP. I mean, this is a mainstream figure. And so what I'm trying to say in as quick a way as I can is the following. The broad trend is that the U.S. is going to be leaving the Middle East. You will see bumps in the road, and you will see obviously more engagement, and it's quite possible that this president, under intense pressure, will engage in a deeper way in what's going on in Syria and Iraq. And certainly the next president is going to make a very public show of reinforcing old relationships that came under strain because President Obama questioned some of the assumptions underlying those relationships. But long term, we are leaving. And so Israel's hope in America is that Americans continue to recognize Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, as a liberal beacon in a very, very dark region. And so the Israeli government, in my humble opinion, isn't aware of the changes in America, that Americans are sick of the Middle East, and could grow sick of Israel if they see Israel as just another problem child in the Middle East. And so that is the real danger. It's not a danger in the immediate term, but it's a danger that we're moving to very quickly, because I don't think that the trend that Obama initiated toward Asia, toward other regions of the world, and away from the Middle East, a place that most Americans at this point would like to cauterize and leave to stew in its own extremism. That trend is not stopping, and so the Israeli government has to be aware that trend is not stopping. That Americans who no longer see Israel as something worthy of support will not support it. And let me end there. I have to say, by the way, I'm very pleased, and I should have said this at the outset. I'm very pleased that you've created in this space a big enough tent for all of these different opinions. I'm really looking forward to the Jewish diversity panel in a few minutes with Peter Beinart and Brett Stevens. We'll just see how big the tent really is. But anyway, I thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you very much.
So, is my mic on? Okay, so the first question is, how much has the personal friction between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu affected overall relations?
It's a good question. That is actually somewhat, I mean, people in my profession love, I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone. We love to analyze we love to do the psychoanalysis of the relationship and, the toxic marriage between the two men. I think it's a symptom of a broader problem rather than the problem itself, in the sense that when Obama departs the scene in a year and Netanyahu departs the scene in 30 or 40 years, the underlying problems, the underlying tensions will remain. Well, you can mask it if there's a Republican president. Let's say Marco Rubio is president next, or Ted Cruz. You'll be able to mask that tension. But the underlying tension is there, and it has to do with the way liberal politics are developing in America. I mean, the relationship has been unnecessarily harmful, obviously. And I don't want to get into the apportionment of blame. I would say that we entered a whole new phase when the Prime Minister came at the invitation of the Republicans to address the Republicans to lobby against the Democratic president. That's never happened before in the relationship between Israel and America. And that was a let's say a bold move on the part of someone who ostensibly claims to hold in such high esteem the relationship between Israel and America and understand it. But it's ultimately just a symptom of a broader issue.
Okay, this question is for Alof or for Jeffrey? Not sure, but it's the one that's on the screen, so I'm going to ask it to you anyway. You going to answer this, or because I've got some other questions about? Okay, so how can we put the Middle East in the rear view when Western countries, such as France, are being brought into the war with ISIS? It's an issue of national security, and the radicalization has already reached our borders, says Lily Greenberg Call.
It's also a good question. And we're not. I mean, I hope I was articulate enough to make the point that we're not leaving now. Because we still do get oil, and obviously it's one global oil economy, and you can't just sort of abandon the Middle East right now and abandon the Strait of Hormuz to Iran. And on the terrorism front, obviously the West is going to have to find a way to manage ISIS so it's not a threat. I'm not in the. Maybe it's because I've been traveling with the president for the last week, who's like Mr. Spock on these kind of things, and that's actually generally a good thing. But I'm not in the camp of people who believe that ISIS is a sort of an existential threat, that it's an undefeatable or unmanageable threat. And so obviously we are going to be in this for a while, with France, with Russia, with the rest of the West. But there is no defeat for this. And so, and this is something that no politician would say for obvious reasons, but we are going to learn how to live with this problem. We've been learning how to live with this problem for 14 years. This is a new iteration of the same problem. And, one of the interesting things, I've been thinking a lot about this, we are going to have to tolerate a certain level of Muslim extremist violence the way we've learned to tolerate school shootings. And obviously, as a society, we've learned how to tolerate school shootings, unfortunately, but we have. And so we are, I think any rational president in private would admit that there's no defeat for this. What you do is you marginalize it, you contain it, and like I said, you cauterize. I mean, the goal is to cauterize the Middle East and protect the rest of the world from the Middle East. Now, this goes back to this basic problem. Israel is in the Middle East. It's stuck there. And so you have to have a carve-out, literal and figurative, for Israel, which is why it's important, and again, I'm going to keep banging on this point, which is why it's important for Israel to understand how it's perceived and how it's understood. If it becomes understood as part of the problem, or if it becomes understood as just another dysfunctional Middle Eastern country, then it will be easier to leave the entire region and cauterize Israel when you're cauterizing all the rest. But obviously, we're in the Middle East for a while because of this problem, if nothing else.
Thank you. Got a question here from Marlene Mayer. How can we promote Israel as a vibrant and messy democracy when we're constantly put in a defensive posture?
Well, there's a friend of mine always says that there's two kinds of problems in the world. There are public relations problems, and then there's problems. And Israel has both. I'm not into Hasbara, so I mean, I'll just say you can't. I get these emails. I'm on every stupid list on the internet for, I get these emails. Israel invents a new orange tomato that cures cancer. Israel invents it turns chicken soup into irrigation water. And it's all great, fine. I mean, Israel is Israel is in a way sort of the Singapore of the Middle East. It's the place where positive things do happen. And so there's a lot of attempts on the part of Israeli organizations, Jewish organizations in America, to show how wonderful it is. And I made Aliyah. I think it is a wonderful place, and it's a miraculous place. But, you can't. The narrative is the narrative, and the Palestinian narrative has won the battle of the narratives through most of the West. Part of it is just numbers. I mean, we're not China. China can change the weather. But the Jews can't. The Jews aren't big enough to change the weather around them. And so, one of the ways you and this is what Tzipi and I were talking about a little while ago is, when Israel is not perceived as pursuing some kind, I don't use the term peace anymore because we're not going to have peace, but pursuing some kind of more equitable arrangement or equitable divorce with the Palestinians, when Israel is not perceived as wanting that, then Israel runs into PR trouble, and there's nothing you can do to stop that. By the way, just this is something I think Shimon Peres stole this joke from me. But my idea has always been that the Jews actually enter a formal alliance with the Chinese because together we're like 1.5 billion people, and then we could change the weather. But it's not going to happen.
We've got a question now from Oren Zeev, and he asks, is there a scenario that the US lets Assad recapture Syria as the lesser of two evils?
Well, you have a capacious definition of a lesser evil, right? I don't think there's a scenario like that. I mean, the position of the United States is that Assad has to go. By the way, the analytically correct way of understanding this is that ISIS is partially an outgrowth. ISIS gets its energy. It feeds off of the Assad regime. So in order to solve your ISIS problem, not that it's ever going to be fully solved, in order to solve your ISIS problem, you have to solve your Assad problem. And this is the fundamental problem of forming an alliance with Russia, is that Russia obviously believes something polar opposite, that you defeat ISIS by strengthening Assad because they're Assad's patron. I don't envision a moment when the U.S. sort of throws up its hands and said, okay, we're just going to buttress Assad and help him kill ISIS and kill all the other associated groups. It doesn't seem likely, although, the thing that we always forget, and Paris, I think, has taught us this, the thing that we always forget is that we're always one devastating terror attack away from a complete upending of all of our assumptions and all of our policies. Obviously, every president knows this, and this president knows that he could wake up in the morning to a completely different world where we're invading Syria and Iraq. He would never, obviously, say this in public, but I think it's generally understood. But no, I don't see a situation like that as things stand right now.
Okay, final question I have here. If Israel needs to reflect America in order to maintain American support, and yet Israel's neighborhood is less and less reflective of anything America has to face, how should Israel cope with that?
Pass. Do I get a pass? I don't get a pass, right? Look, Israel has done, so after 9/11, right, we in America, you could argue, to some degree, lost our heads. It was completely understandable. We lost, we lost control of emotions, and we did things that now many Americans regret on the torture issues, on other constitutional issues. That was one attack, one horrible, grievous, terrible attack, but it was one attack. Israel has a 9/11 more or less every couple of years, right? And yet Israel, for its entire history, has managed to maintain a free press, an independent judiciary, a vibrant debating culture, a culture in which, and a polity in which Arabs are fully enfranchised, Arab Israeli citizens are fully enfranchised and represent in the Knesset. Obviously, there are problems on that front, but the law is the law, and so Israel has maintained this throughout its history. This isn't the roughest moment Israel has ever been in. In its roughest moments, it managed to maintain its commitment to the liberal values of the West. It's one of the reasons we admire Israel so much, that it maintains equanimity even in the face of all this. And so I don't see that as particularly the biggest challenge. Israel's security forces are excellent. Israeli society is resilient in a way that some of these Western societies are not. And the sad thing would be if Israel responds to the disintegration of the neighborhood by letting go of its original values, the values that Herzl talked about, the values that Ben-Gurion and Begin, by the way, cherished so much. And so I think that Israel's been through worse, and it's important to keep focus on the things that make Israel different and better than the region. And obviously its commitment to the ideals of liberal democracy are those things.
Thank you.